Now, before we can actually use a variable, we have to declare it first. And this is true for most other programming languages. You've seen this before. Whenever we declare a variable, what happens is we're allocating memory in our computer to actually store the value of the variable. If we did not include some type of declaration statement, the program is going to say, I don't know where to store this. This is not going to work. I don't have a place to store this value. So the declaration statement is going to allow us to say, we need to allocate memory for this type of data, and this is what we're going to call it. So the way we do that in Visual Basic, we're going to use what's called a dim statement. This is just like a declaration statement we've seen before in other languages like C++ or Java. The difference is just the syntax of it. So let me give you the syntax for a dim statement. So we would have dim, the word dim, and then name is the name of our variable. Then we have the word as, and then whatever our data type is. So it's a little different than what we've seen in other languages. Like, for example, if we wanted to declare an integer called x in Java, we would just say int x and then a semicolon. But here, we would have to do something like dim x as integer. Or let me give you another example. We can have something like dim and then maybe team1 total, and that's our identifier, and then as integer. But the whole point here is whenever we want to declare a variable, we have to have the word dim, the name of the variable, the word as, and then the actual data type. The word dim is actually a modifier. In fact, you might be wondering why the word dim. Well, in BASIC, like original BASIC, dim stood for dimension, and it was used to define the dimensions of an array. So that's kind of how it carried over to Visual Basic. It's just used to define any variable, not just arrays. But there are other modifiers that we can include in our declaration statements. We have things like public, private, and static. And these work pretty much the same thing as we've seen in Java. By default, a variable is always set as private. So if you wanted to change that, you would have to explicitly decide whether you want to make it public or static. But by default, all variables are private, so we don't have to say like dim private and so forth. Now we could actually omit the dim portion of the statement if we really wanted to. We would have to declare the variable after the access modifier. So in this case, if we took out the dim, we would need to put in the access modifier, whether it's public or private, in its place. So we could say something like private x as double if we didn't want to use the dim statement. But the norm is that we would use dim in here. So we would just say dim x as double. Once a variable is declared, we need to initialize it before using it. Now, we have mentioned before that with integers, doubles, and decimals, the default values are 0, but it's still good to get into a habit of initializing your variables. So how do we do initialization? Well, we have to assign a value to the variable. So the way we do that is we would write the variable name, then an equal sign, and then the value itself. Notice I didn't say something afterwards. That was intentional. Unlike other programming languages, we don't have semicolons. In Visual Basic, there are no semicolons at the ends of any lines. So when I say name, an equal sign, and a value, I mean name, equal sign, value, no semicolon. Let me give you a couple of examples just to make sure we're clear on this. So I could declare a variable called count. So I would have dim count as integer on one line. And then the next line I can do count equals 0. Notice there's no semicolon. Now you might be wondering, well, can't we just initialize on the same line as we declare, like in other languages? And yeah, we can do that. We can do dim count as integer and then include the equals 0 right afterwards. Once again, there is no semicolon at the end. We'll take a look at a couple more examples of declaration and assignment statements just to make sure we have a really good feel of how to use them in Visual Basic. All these statements are perfectly valid. I just want to make sure that you understand that. I'm not going to ask you, is this statement valid or invalid? They're all perfectly valid. So I can have a statement like this, dim count as integer equals 10, which we kind of already saw. So we can declare a variable and initialize it on the same line. And we can just set it equal to 10, 0, 5, negative 20, whatever we want. So this is perfectly fine. I can do expressions with my initialization. So here we're going to assume that count has been declared, and maybe I have another variable called mynum, so I can do dim mynum as integer, and then I can initialize that to count plus 1. That's perfectly fine as long as count has been declared and there is a value in count. So we can also have this type of assignment statement where count just equals count plus 5. So here we're taking the value of count and we're incrementing it by 5 and then storing it back into count. This is a perfectly valid assignment statement. So what's on the right-hand side of the equal sign is going to be some expression that's going to evaluate to some integer. And then count itself on the left-hand side is going to be the variable that we store the expression in. We can also do stuff with strings. So I can have str be a string. So I can say dim str as string. And I can initialize it to the string 23.5% are passing. So anything between the quotes is perfectly fine. So we have a string here that would be stored in str. And then I could do something like this, where I have mynum equals the result of the val method for str. Actually, let me ask you a question. So what would be stored in mynum in this case? So just pause the video for a second and think about what would actually be stored. So remember, the way the val method works is if I have a string that's not a complete number, but it starts with a number, it's going to store that portion of the number. So we're going to read 2, 3, the point, the 5, and then the percent sign, it recognizes that's not a valid number. So that means that mynum in this case is going to store 23.5. There are a couple of more things I want to mention about variables and assignments in general. So whenever we have a variable, it has to be declared before we can use it. Before we can assign any values to the variables, we have to declare them first. This is true for any programming language. Visual Basic is no exception. You have to have that dim statement to declare the variable before we can do any type of expressions with it, before we can store any values in them. Now, as we mentioned before, whenever we declare a variable, there are assigned default values from the get-go. And this is why initialization is important, because for numeric data types, the default value is 0. So unless you want the initial value to be 0, you do want to initialize it to something else. As we mentioned with strings, the initialization part, the default value is null. There isn't anything there. So it's a good idea to initialize it to at least the empty string. If you want, I recommend you do initialize it to the empty string, but we do want to initialize our variables whenever possible, unless you like the default value. The last thing I'll mention about variables is make sure that when you do declare them, give them meaningful names before you actually use them. For example, let's say I do dim x as integer, and then later in my code I use x. Well, what's x? What's the purpose of it? What are we storing in there? I know we're storing numbers, but we don't really know the importance of x. Just like in other languages, it's a good idea to give meaningful names to our variables. That way, when we use them later in the code, we can remember what the purpose of that variable is. For example, maybe we're trying to take the sum of a bunch of numbers. We're asking the user for some integers, and then we need to store these values and maybe add it to our sum. If I just called our sum x, I might remember that x means the sum, but it makes more sense to call that variable sum instead of x. So just make sure that you give useful names. That way you remember what that variable does if you have to look at the code later on.